It has been more than 70 years since Vietnam was invaded by France and became part of the Indochinese Federation. Those were 70 years of violence, exploitation, and poverty. The Vietnamese people had endured for far too long, far too much. There had been many efforts by the Vietnamese to win independence, but nothing had changed. The French were still there. Still violence, still exploitation, still poverty. The Vietnamese prayed for a savior, a messiah to deliver them from the darkness. In 1911, in Saigon, Indochinese Federation, a 21-year-old Vietnamese youth boarded the ship Amiral Latouche-Tréville. He hoped to find a new path so that his nation could gain independence, a path for poor peasants to rise up against colonialism. That was when he found communism. In 1930, in British Hong Kong, the 20-year-old youth of the past was now a middle-aged man and a member of the Comintern. There, he united 3 communist organizations of Vietnam into one and founded the Communist Party of Vietnam. In 1941, he returned to Vietnam after 30 years of wandering to directly lead the communist movement in the country. In 1942, that man once again went to China to seek help from the Republic of China. And from then on, he used the name that, until today, stirs different emotions among Vietnamese, French, and Americans alike. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was imprisoned by Chiang Kai-shek's government, accused of being a spy. Later, thanks to a request from the Americans, Ho Chi Minh was released and returned to Vietnam. At the same time, in the semi-colony that the Vietnamese wished to overthrow, major events were taking place. World War II broke out. France fell into the hands of Hitler's bloc, and Japan, Hitler's ally in Asia, took the opportunity to enter Indochina. The Vietnamese now lay not only under the French yoke, but also under another yoke from the Japanese. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh organization he founded stood on the side of the Allies to fight against the Japanese. The Americans, the leading member of the Allies and the one directly confronting Japan in the Pacific, liked this. They helped the Viet Minh with combat training and weapons. You can look at this photo. Here are Ho Chi Minh, Vong Nguyen Giap, and members of the American OSS intelligence agency. And here is Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence in 1945, in which he quoted America's 1776 Declaration as an argument for his own. Ho Chi Minh respected America. He never considered America a colonial power like France. An unlikely alliance, but would it last long? In May 1945, the European front of World War II ended. The Soviet Union marched into Berlin, and Hitler's Nazi Germany collapsed. 3 months later, the United States dropped the first 2 atomic bombs of mankind on Japan, forcing Japan to surrender unconditionally. Taking advantage of the political vacuum in Indochina after Japan's surrender, Ho Chi Minh organized the August Revolution and officially established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Just a few days later, the 3 allies met again to discuss the New World Order after victory. Here, differences and cracks began to appear. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted Indochina to be returned to independence for the local people instead of going back to the French. Would Ho Chi Minh's and Vietnam's wish finally come true? No, because President Franklin D. Roosevelt died before witnessing the victory of the war he had led. His successor was Harry S. Truman, a completely different man. Truman had no concern for the independence movements of colonial countries, and France had returned to Vietnam. Harry S. Truman was not Roosevelt, and he did not rule for a world like Roosevelt envisioned. During World War II on the European front, the Soviet Union, in the process of liberating Eastern Europe, advanced rapidly. Thus, Churchill wanted the Eastern European countries to become a neutral buffer zone between the two sides. But with what Stalin was doing, the only thing between the two was an iron curtain. As for Truman, Truman was also an anti-communist. In Truman's eyes, Stalin was just another version of Hitler, nothing more, nothing less. Worse, Stalin's expansionist policy was spreading to Iran, Turkey, and Greece, countries extremely important to America in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Truman went mad over this. He decided to carry out the Marshall Plan to help Western European countries recover in order to prevent the Soviet Union from continuing to expand westward. The world had just passed through one war, but immediately another war was beginning, the Cold War with two poles, the socialist pole of the Soviet Union and the anti-communist pole of America and Western Europe. These successive events sparked an idea, a theory, in Truman's mind, the domino theory. After the war with Japan ended, in China, the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's communist forces continued. Truman's administration did not trust Chiang Kai-shek and did not provide much support. The Republic of China lost, forced to flee to Taiwan. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. This was a punch in Truman's face. The most populous country in the world had fallen into communist hands. Even later, after no longer serving as president, Truman was still criticized by his successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, for not aiding Chiang Kai-shek and letting China slip away. Not yet recovered from Mao Zedong's first punch, Truman received a second. He was shocked to see the North Korean army under Kim Il-sung, a leader supported by the communists, sweeping south to invade the South Korean state that the US had set up. Truman went crazy. The Korean War set a standard for wars during the Cold War. The two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US, would not declare war on each other. Instead, they would pour money, weapons, and troops into their allied sides in the conflict. It also set a goal for both sides. Whichever country fell into the other side's hands, that was a defeat. Mao Zedong's aid to Kim Il-sung also opened Truman's eyes to how communists could use force to achieve their goals. China's reaction after the US crossed the 38th parallel made Truman realize there were red lines he could not cross. And finally, look at the map. These were the countries that had fallen into Soviet hands. What did they have in common? They were close to each other. And so, one by one, countries fell into communism, just like dominoes toppling after the first falls. This reinforced what Truman thought. Communism could spread. If one country fell into communist hands, the surrounding countries would fall too. And who was the leader of this communism? That was how the domino theory was born. Thus, suddenly, Vietnam, a country that had suffered from colonialism's return, that Truman's administration had been completely indifferent to, became a special concern. But why Vietnam? Vietnam lay right under China. Immediately after the People's Republic of China was founded, Mao Zedong began pouring aid to the Viet Minh to win independence from the returning French. Putting the domino theory into this context, China had fallen, North Korea had fallen, Vietnam would fall, then Laos, Cambodia, then all of Southeast Asia, and Asia would fall before communism. And the one laughing the loudest would be the man sitting in the Kremlin. Southeast Asia was a region rich in resources and an important transportation route for the US. If Vietnam was lost, this would be a disaster for Truman. They could lose the war, just a few years after it had begun. In the White House, no one would allow this to happen. So the top goal now was not to let Vietnam fall into the hands of Ho Chi Minh's communist government. Ho Chi Minh, who had once been an ally against Japan. But drawing lessons from what happened in Korea, the Americans would not intervene directly. Instead, they turned to their Western European ally, who was already there and kept pouring support into them to fight the Viet Minh. What did all this bring? Defeat after defeat, and the shattering final failure at Dien Bien Phu. And after that, the collapse of an empire. The French lost and had to sit at the negotiating table in Geneva. There, the parties agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam into two halves at the 17th parallel. The North temporarily under Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the South temporarily held by the State of Vietnam. For those who wonder, the State of Vietnam was a pro-French government created when the French first returned, headed by former emperor and former supreme advisor of Ho Chi Minh's government, Bao Dai. The Viet Minh in the South would withdraw to the north, and French troops in the north would withdraw to the south. People on both sides also had 300 days to freely move to whichever side they chose. Hundreds of thousands, mainly Catholics, followed this to go south because they did not want to live under a communist regime. After everything was settled in July 1956, both the North and South would hold general elections to unify the country. At that time, the French would withdraw from Vietnam. But no side was happy with the Geneva Accords. The French, of course. They were forced to leave the colony they had held for nearly 100 years after a humiliating defeat. The communist government in Hanoi was not pleased either, because after years of fighting, they were still divided and had to wait 2 years for a general election. They had wanted to use force to completely drive the French out of the South and decide unification on their own. But the two big brothers of the socialist bloc did not want that. After the Korean War, China did not want to be dragged into another war, and the Soviet Union did not want tensions to escalate, leading to possible U.S. direct intervention. They threatened to cut off aid to Ho Chi Minh's government if he did not comply. Although Hanoi was still certain of winning this general election since Ho Chi Minh was extremely popular among the people, what had been agreed upon fell far short of their expectations. But that dissatisfaction was nothing compared to these two, the U.S. and Ngo Dinh Diem. The U.S. already knew the election 2 years later would be a landslide victory for Ho Chi Minh. This was what Eisenhower, Truman's successor, said about North Vietnam. This meant Vietnam would fall into communist hands and trigger the domino chain in Southeast Asia, a defeat before the Soviet Union right ahead. The second person, extremely furious, was Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem simply hated every regime that had ruled this S-shaped land. He hated Bao Dai because Bao Dai was pro-French, while Diem pursued decolonization. He hated Ho Chi Minh simply because Diem was deeply anti-communist. Diem wanted South Vietnam to be under his own hands, but there were obstacles he had to clear on his path to ultimate power in Saigon. The Viet Minh were still in Saigon, ready for the general election. The French troops had not yet fully withdrawn. Many areas were still controlled by religious groups. And most importantly, in Saigon, the Binh Xuyen, a notorious crime organization backed by the French, even with its own army, was controlling much of the city. Diem rubbed his hands and thought, it's time to crush them all. Diem succeeded in defeating the Binh Xuyen army in a bloody battle in Saigon in 1955. He also succeeded in persuading some Hoa Hao and Cao Dai leaders to join him. As for the Viet Minh and communism, let that wait. After Diem overthrew Bao Dai and tightened his grip in Saigon, the Battle of Saigon in 1955 increased Diem's prestige among the South Vietnamese people. He had succeeded in eliminating the last French influence in the South. He loudly promised democracy, in contrast to the communist regime in the North, where the land reform was unfolding brutally. What Diem did was exactly what America intended to do in South Vietnam, a government against the red wave reaching Saigon. The Americans did not trust Diem, but Ngo Dinh Diem succeeded in pulling the Americans to his side. In the wave of support for Diem in Saigon, the Americans had no choice but to support him. Otherwise, Vietnam would fall completely into communist hands. With American backing, Ngo Dinh Diem organized a referendum to decide whether he or Bao Dai would lead the southern state of Vietnam. The result was already clear before the referendum took place, but for someone constantly shouting that the new government would be free and democratic, Diem should have made the results sound more reasonable. Even the Americans advised Diem, "We know you will rig the vote, but don't make it too obvious." Diem listened to no one. He did as he pleased. 98.91% in favor of Ngo Dinh Diem, a number so high it clearly revealed fraud. Thus, the state of Vietnam was no more. Bao Dai was overthrown, and south of the 17th parallel was replaced by the Republic of Vietnam. A new president, Ngo Dinh Diem, was born. The Americans had achieved what they wanted in Vietnam, at least at that time. They believed that if they supported the new government strongly enough, the Soviet Union and China would not be able to expand further in Southeast Asia, and the domino called Vietnam would never fall. But they had no idea that the very moment they supported Diem in South Vietnam was the beginning of one of the wars that changed American history. We will leave Diem here, because he will be the main character in the next part of the Vietnam War series. We do not yet know how North Vietnam and the communists would react to what happened in the South, and why these things eventually led to a full-scale war, not only in Vietnam, but throughout Indochina. Today, as we sit here 50 years later, generations both old and young in both nations are still living in the haunting shadow of this war. A war that was not only a struggle for the dream of national unification, but also a duel to determine whose flag would wave over the entire world when the game ended.